Good evening and welcome to the philosophy research discussion. 7th of September, 4th or 5th, 3rd, 4th, 5th, something like that. Of these relaxed Monday night philosophy discussions where basically I'll just talk a little bit about what I've been up to that week, what I'm thinking about, and kind of do the philosophizing in public. Obviously that means a lot of this stuff is not finished. The thoughts are kind of partly thoughts in process. And I've also been engaging in conversations. So last week I had a conversation with partner Morrigan Nihil, and a couple of weeks before that I had a conversation with Eric Harper, who I co-write with, and so this is your philosophy research discussion, philosophy in practice. This is what a philosopher does and thinking about, which can be a bit strange sometimes. If you're just coming in, then you can catch up with past episodes if you're particularly interested. They're on YouTube or they're highlighted on Twitch, and over at twitch.tv/RazorSmile, you can find a whole bunch of links to social media and other bits and pieces if you need to get in touch with me. And if you're interested, the best way is through Discord. I have a Discord set up. You're welcome to join. Questions, post bits and pieces if you want, as long as you're not an idiot. Anyway, so for the last couple of weeks, yeah, I've been talking mainly because I've been working on the problematic between revolutionary politics and desire, and essentially the problem there is something I've mentioned before, something like, with fascism in the air, and fascism having a very specific relationship to what I call the mobilization of desire. So fascism exists by mobilizing people's desires, desires to both be part of something and to exclude others as part of that. Desires to be, better, desires to win, all sorts of desires that fascism mobilizes, and often also desires that express themselves in racial or sexual, gendered ways. And so you end up, we're not just talking about Trump support, we're talking about a kind of more general dynamic towards fascism or politics, and which at this moment is more live than it ever has been, partly because of people like Trump, Bolsonaro and others, enabling this kind of ongoing fascist desire mobilization to kind of be expressed and get an audience and to get its hands on the levers of power, all that kind of thing. Now, let's be clear, I don't think at this point Trump is necessarily straightforwardly a fascist. Classical Marxist terms, he might be thought of as some Bonapartist, I'm not sure. An autocrat and an oligarch, perhaps, in making. Whether he's a full-on fascist at the moment is difficult to say, because that kind of depends in many ways, I think, upon the relationship between the leader and the movement. So that's an ambiguous one, but it's also, fascism is going to look different in the 2020s than it did in the 1920s, and it may well be that is the face of fascism today. But it's not just about this elected officials, as I say. I'm more interested in this kind of relationship to social desire that is often connected to fascism, and in the work of Deleuze and Guattari and schizoanalysis, with the philosophy of desire. One of the things that's kind of important is dealing with fascism both at we might call a political level, they might call a macro political level. In other words, in the domain of politics as we encounter it in the news and in political theory. But they also want to deal with fascism at the sort of micro, what's called sometimes the micro level, or the domain at which we encounter it in feelings, reactions, responses, emotional kind of day-to-day life, the way in which it gets caught. And so I'm interested, I suppose, and have been for a while, in kind of mismatch between revolutionary politics that presents itself as being super rational, super sensible, super fair, always the good guy and gal. In fact, that's obviously not the case. If you're ever involved in revolutionary, messy, full of human flaws as any other place. But there's something kind of important about the way in which that image that the left often has of itself hides this really big problem with. So I'm interested in kind of trying to work out a way of, as I said a couple of weeks ago, being able to get a revolutionary mobilization of desire that doesn't collapse into fascism, which is a problematic that's necessarily mine as a problematic that Guattari and Oedipus its analysis more generally, where the fascist within is often kind of key concept that they might use. Anyway, so that's a brief catch up with what we've been doing, what's going on, where we're at. As I say, if you want to get involved anymore, you're more than welcome to contact us via the Discord. Oh God, and it's been such a mad, hectic day. Usually I spend Mondays kind of making some notes, sitting, reading, thinking, doing, like spending the day, which I don't often get the time to do. But spending the whole day devoted to philosophy and working on what I'm working on at that particular point, fully immersed by the evening, which hasn't been the case today. No, it's return to school day. Granddaughter has been back to school. I'm now in the mode of pickup. She lives about half an hour ride away. I ride a motorbike, so she lives about half an hour ride away. Ride there, pick her up, make a cup of tea, sort out her bags and stuff. Wait for mum to get home, ride back. That's my afternoon. And it's the first one today. It's always a bit hectic when you first one. You forget you're doing it. But it's been a bit of a hectic day. But what I've been up to. So what does a philosopher? Well, this one does a lot of caring, so looking after people. But as a philosopher, what I've been doing is obviously I spend a lot of time reading and studying, and quite a bit of time trying to work out ways of producing writing, if you like, or responses or thoughts, and then obviously teaching. And we haven't had much teaching for the last while, so I've been spending a bit more time doing research, perhaps as you usually do. And I've spent a lot of time actually over the last couple of weeks now reading an awful lot of material around the Black Panthers. So for anyone who's following this, there was a kind of I was using Fred Hampton from the Black Panthers, and Fred Hampton's phrase "I am a revolutionary," and this is a kind of rhetorical phrase that Fred Hampton was famous for, in a sense. And I was using that as a kind of starting point for thinking about that relationship to revolution and desire because of its way of mobilizing people. So it was often, I've seen it as a kind of call and response. I am, Fred Hampton would call out and then he would get to the point at which the audience was able to respond with a revolutionary. So he would begin, like a lot of call and responses, he would begin the I am a revolutionary. Then he would get that crowd whipped up, get their desires mobilized. I mean, that's what I mean when I talk about desires being mobilized. Excited, angry, but often not in an individualistic way, often sort of connected to a crowd or a group. The sort of thing you might encounter, demonstration, football match, a cinema, which you also encounter in any other kind of situation. So afternoon, for example, coming back from granddaughter, I had to pop into the supermarket, and both at the school, which is a primary school, and at the supermarket, I'm encountering different forms of mobilization of desire. So, very noticeable at the moment with regard to masks, for example. So there was no masks at all around the school. Everything, all intents and purposes, just appeared very much like it had before COVID, apart from when you got to the school, there was different ways of walking around. But apart from that, you wouldn't have noticed from the outside. And so there was a kind of, the desire there is to try and keep things normal, try and keep things tidy, organised, calm, to try and keep things calm for the kids, to try and give them that kind of space. Whereas in the supermarket, everyone's masked up, and the desire there is to sort of, be able to do your shopping because they won't let you in unless you've got a mask on, I expect, but also to acknowledge the COVID. But one of the things I suppose to acknowledge the necessity of collective solidarity, wearing of a this sort of situation. Although, I did notice that a lot of the staff weren't wearing masks because obviously they're there all day long and perhaps don't need to anymore because the mask, we know, doesn't protect you; it protects other people. That's the claim, or that's the idea, and I think that's fairly true. Yeah, so it's been a busy week. A lot of thinking about the Black Panthers. As I say, that comes out of like looking onto this particular piece by Fred Hampton, and a lot of focus in that research on the Panthers, partly in terms of getting a timeline in my head of because it's a relatively quick period of time between 66 and 76, where the vast majority of this kind of activity takes place. Although the Panthers aren't wound up until I think it's 82, that 10-year period is like the rise and fall, if you like, of the Panthers as a mass organisation. And so part of it's getting the timeline in my head, particularly the timeline of what's the split, which is the thing that occurs between Cleaver and Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton, and between certain sections of the party and other sections. So partly getting the timeline in my head as a historical account, so I'm kind of framing up the context. One of the things I was particularly interested in, and it came about from getting hold of this book. Look for Me in the Whirlwind. Bloody great book. It's the autobiography of the Panther 21, a huge court case that took place in the very early 70s. And it's an autobiography that they wrote at the time, which each of them kind of tells this brilliantly personal narrative of their life and then involvement in the Panthers. But it's also it's bookended as a text now. It's been produced by PM Press. It's a very, very good book. It's been bookended now with a whole series of articles by contemporary articles by political prisoners that are from that particular time in the early 70s, from the Black Liberation Army, which was like the armed wing of the Panthers. And a whole bunch of kind of interesting contemporary takes on the Panthers in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a very contemporary book, and it's talking about the sort of the Black Panthers in as part of that history of activism and revolution that goes up to and inspires, and to some extent, people inside the Black Lives Matter movement. In particular, you can see that kind of encounter in various tropes, in various slogans that are used, in various figures like Assata Shakur, who are kind of held up as key figures. So that book, Look for Me in the Whirlwind, it's a really, really interesting book on the Panthers, and it's also about the East Coast Panthers, so the Panthers from New York, not the West Coast Panthers, which is Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And so that's been a lot of my research, looking into that, and then pursuing the lines of a couple of other kind of personal stories, if you like, the kind of personal accounts. So I don't know if I think of them as first-hand. I suppose they are. I suppose that's what they are. First-hand accounts, primary document, if you like, rather than a kind of an official history. And explore. So I've been doing a lot of research like that into sort of get a sense of who the Panthers were and how they worked, because I think that's kind of, if we're looking at the question of revolutionary and desire, one of the things that's plain is that to a certain extent the Panthers are successful in the mobilization of desire, mobilization of revolutionary desire, but at the same time they're also caught up in an extreme level of violence society is placing upon. And so the way in which they responded and organised and dealt with that, I think, offers a much better example of revolutionary practice in many ways, particularly if you live in Western capitalist countries. It offers a much better example of revolutionary practice than going back to 1917 Russia or 1930s Spain, or or even examples, contemporary examples in Mexico or Rojava. I mean, all of which can be very powerful and inspiring, but are in very, very different geopolitical contexts. Whereas at least, one of the interesting things about the Panthers, of course, is that it's in the belly of the beast, right in the heart of contemporary capitalism at the time. And it's very keyed into that in terms of its thoughts, talking, its way of operating, all that kind of stuff. So that's been a lot of my work for the last couple of weeks, is trawling the internet. There's tons and tons of stuff out there, actually, which in itself is interesting. But trawling the internet, watching lots of video pieces, archive footage, reading personal stories on the Panthers in the 60s, 70s, and as they come out of that, and just generally trying to get a sense of the way in which desire and revolution were combined and operated situation as part of what I'm doing. What else have we been up to? So the other things, of course, is I start teaching again at the Free University of Brighton in about a month, and I'm teaching a course on Plato and Deleuze. The course forum is up on our River, which is our communications platform at the University of Brighton, where we have all our courses and stuff take place and is sorted out. So the course forum's up, and the first, what we're going to do is have a read through some Plato. Ooh. Have a read through some Plato. Phaedrus, a statesman and sophist. I'm going to look at bits of those, and then we're going to have a look at some of the stuff that Deleuze says about Plato and Platonism. It's a 10-week-ish course. It might be another week or two after that. But basically, it's this term coming from October through to December, and that will be Monday nights. So that's my Monday nights. Will move from being just general conversations about philosophy, obviously with a specific subject in mind, and that's been revolution and desire for the last few weeks. But it'll move from being general conversations about philosophy into being like class specific. So these Monday sessions from 7 will begin to focus on Plato and then Deleuze. I'll talk about that. You need to wonder about it too much at the moment as to what the connection is. It should be the kind of course that if you're interested in just learning a bit about philosophy, then it will hopefully be able to do that. It will hopefully be able to sort of present enough of the Plato and enough of the argument that Deleuze put forward in a kind of understandable way. You don't need to have some massive kind of background to this. But for those people who are interested in Deleuze in particular, I mean, not Plato. I'm not a Plato expert. I'm more of a Deleuze scholar. But for those people who are particularly interested in Deleuze, it will offer a way of you actually reading a lot more closely some of his arguments about Platonism, and in particular some of the curious ways in which this notion of an idea kind of in dispute, what an idea is. So is that all I've been up to? I've been doing loads of other stuff. Well, it's been a really busy summer. I'm going camping next weekend. Quite looking forward to that, even if it is pissing with rain for the whole weekend. Having a fire, cooking some shit over an open fire, and sleeping on the bare ground, on my sheepskin on the earth. Don't have a fly sheet in our tent, so we just sort of sleep on the earth. Oh, God, I haven't done that since lockdown, and I'm really looking forward to that. So, yeah, busy. Other things as well. Did want to take a pause for a minute. So I've got a bit of text that I'm going to read. I think I'll do that first, and then have a little bit of. I want to have a little bit of a chat about ideas afterwards. So I'd kind of thought I'd do that first, talk about the ideas afterwards. But I think I might do the text. Yes. Yeah. So I'm going to read a short-ish, probably only a couple of thousand words at the moment. A shortish text that I'm working on. Now, as I've been talking about revolution and desire, it's perhaps unsurprising that this is a kind of text in that frame. It is a rhetorical text, so it doesn't try and be neutral. It has a kind of rhetoric to it. Although I must admit, I'm not a very good writer. My rhetoric is often not very consciously thought through. I have to try and work it. But it is a kind of rhetorical text, and it is a kind of it's philosophically inspired rather than being philosophical. And what I would distinguish between the two is a text that's kind of more rhetorical is one that seems to have an answer, whereas when a text is more philosophical, it's often troubling answers and pushing towards different kinds of questions. That's a really crude kind of moment, because even in philosophy we have to kind of try and produce a thought that moves somewhere, that does something, and so to the extent that it's doing something, it often looks like it's producing an answer. But the two elements of philosophy, I think, the one where it presents its kind of thoughts on the world, the way in which it thinks the world is, it's that element that often is necessarily has to use a kind of rhetoric to establish its point. It's necessarily it has to some extent a sense of wanting to persuade you, whereas the more philosophical moment, if you like, wants to avoid persuading you, no matter what. And I think this is one of the reasons I think there's a tension between political philosophy and philosophy kind of in its heart, is because philosopher in their heart, right at the heart of their practice, knows in a sense that persuasion is a weak substitute for thought, and that you can persuade people reasonably easily. That's not necessarily true, I suppose, but it seems a lot easier to persuade people than to get them to think. Because to get someone to think, in a sense, you have to be in a moment of questioning, in a moment of being troubled, or at least, unsettled by, in part, your own thoughts. Anyway, that's a little bit of context. So as I say, this is a short bit of text. Again, this is part of doing philosophy in public. You possibly wouldn't ever see this text, or it might become part of a book, or but at the moment these are kind of little moments. We are on becoming a current, and why the revolutionary body must be organised. We suffer from being already organised by capitalism into an individual. We suffer from being organised by capitalism, and the revolutionary cannot escape this suffering any more than anyone else. If there is a difference that makes any difference, it is this: that the revolutionary reorganises their body into a new form, one that has the capacity to produce joy rather than suffering. Let's say this another way. Capitalism affects everyone. We're all part of the machine, whether we like it or not, including the capitalists. We're divided from each other, arranged into positions of power or powerlessness in specific situations in our life. We're encouraged to hate, to compete, see ourselves as unique individuals, to believe that our success comes from our hard work and our failures from our laziness or lack of talent or mental weakness. We live a way of life that is presented as just the way things are. Nowhere is this more tragic than when we resist this imposition, when we say no and try to escape, when we try to become better than what we've been made into, because then we too easily fall into the worst trap of them all. We begin to say, I am not. I am not this form of oppression. I am not that form of power. I am not part of the machine. And this initial refusal fills us with the joy of resistance. But too often we stay there, in this position where we say, I am not, where we've managed to recover a fragment of ourselves from a world that steals our souls as it pays us our wages. We forget that in saying I, we are always part of the machine that broke us from our common connections with each other and with the world around us, in order to subordinate our activity into a thing that can be bought and sold in order to turn a profit. There is only one force that can sustain any refusal of capitalism, and it arises at the words "we are" begin to take shape. Yet in order to do this, to begin to say "we are," we must undergo something strange, unsettling, uncomfortable, and that feels dangerous. We must undergo a passage beyond our own individual body, that body that says, I am, and begin the slow task of producing a new body, one that can only ever speak by saying, we are. To become revolutionary, one must be able to sustain the desire to go beyond capitalism. The primary function of the revolutionary organisation is to sustain revolutionary desire. Capitalism operates as though it were a natural fact, as though its way of organising society were normal. Capitalism produces an everyday life that we often have no choice but to live within, where we need money to live, and so we are supposed to get a job, earn a crust, and submit to the rules of the everyday life. At the same time, capitalism produces effects that we know to be anything but normal. Revolutionary desire arises from resistance to the normalities of society and is often expressed in terms of some abstract concept, such as justice, freedom, or dignity. This resistance, this impulse to revolt, usually arises from a realization that there's something fundamentally out of kilter in the way things are. We name our resistance to the normal, to the sense that something is wrong, that something is not normal or should not be normal. The difficulty is that when we name our resistance, we begin with the words and concepts that surround us, the majority of which are produced within capitalist normality. It can be hard to see how things can be otherwise when we are told things are normal, that this is just how the world is. We can say no, and for a while we might even be able to do more and begin to organise, begin to get together with others and feel the collective body of which we are part. The return to normal lies in wait, however, dragging us back towards its centre, grinding down our hopes and dreams as we move through the years. And combined with this drag on our dreams is the reality of resistance. The world is a messy place and people come to resist in 1,000 ways, many of which are not at ease with each other. In order to resist, we must both reject the normal but also produce a new world, a new earth. At first, this new earth arises in our hearts as much as our heads. Anger, righteous fury, and fear are common motivations to enter into the journey of resistance. The worst question to ask is what can be done. As we begin to resist, it might be a poetic image, a heroic figure, or a tragic situation that is our guide. The beauty of revolutionary struggle can be found in many places, often surrounded by death and martyrdom, but maintained through love and desire for a new earth. The connections we forge to ideas of freedom arise through the faces and bodies of those who have come before. We enter into a stream of associations, gradually selecting friends from amongst the ancestors, becoming cautious of others and rejecting the routes taken by some. We begin to name ourselves as a kind, as a type of revolutionary. Perhaps we try and avoid too closely associating ourselves with a specific label and instead join with the nameless revolutionaries that make up the ocean of resistance. We begin to dream, but too often we are caught in the dreams of others. Even the dreams of other revolutionaries can be a new trap. Slowly or quickly we begin to believe that we are waking up. Often this arises when we begin to believe that dreams are weak, dangerous, inactive and ineffective. At this point we find ourselves surrounded by the question, but what will you do? We are ushered into the marketplace of political ideas and practice, brought along to meetings, asked, what can you do to make a difference? We quickly forget that the dream of revolution must be grown in its own soil, in its own way, and develop its own connections with the great body of the revolution. We find ourselves in market monoculture of dissent, where the trauma of being made under capitalism is forgotten. We are once again asked to judge, to decide between options that we never asked for, to choose a choice we never wanted. Just like any consumer activity, the monoculture of dissent sells its products, its payment extracted in obedience. The greatest obedience is the need to do something. What are you going to do? This question is just another form of which one do you want to buy. The dream of the revolution slips into nightmare. The lesser evil is accepted and we purchase our nightmares with a vote. We slip the noose around our own necks as we sleepwalk into the other's dreams. For the revolutionary, the first duty is to find a way to live a way of life that cannot exist within capitalism except as an anomaly, an aberration, an outside. The question of how are we to live? In what ways can we begin to dream? This is the real question of the revolutionary. What is to be done? The answer is always, we must begin to live our dreams. Okay, so that was, as I say, just a short piece that I'm sort of part of my writing at the moment, and it's I mean, I think even briefly, you can see that there's a kind of voice there that purports puts themselves forward as knowing something, which is, as I say, a really troublesome mode for the philosopher, because anyway, we'll for numerous reasons we'll maybe get back to that. But the idea at the heart of that text is this idea of the revolutionary, and this is kind of what I'm interested in at the moment. So it's worth maybe thinking about what an idea is. And a good friend, Machinadus, sent me a little voicemail this week, which was private this time. Last time he sent me a voicemail, which is public. You can see it on YouTube if you want. My good friend Machinadus sent me a voicemail this week, and bits of it that weren't private. He was talking at one point about, I think the phrase he used was, he was talking about his engagement with ideas, but he used the phrase as sources of nutrition, and I think this is kind of a crucial way of beginning to understand, in a sense, what it is that does. After doing philosophy now for God knows how, for nearly 30 years, too long, probably, or long enough to maybe begin to know. One of the things that is kind of central to the practice of philosophy is the engagement with ideas. And an idea is not necessarily the same as a concept, and not necessarily the same as a notion. So there are some kind of curiously ambiguous differences between these kind of things, the idea and the concept. Lots of people would make distinctions between those, and the distinction would often be something like the concept is a kind of a rule by which we gather things together. So a concept brings things together, brings singular things together under some kind of general category or set, and often a concept is thought of as the rule that enables us to bring those things together, like a device, if you like, that enables us to say, yes, that's a cow, no, that's a dog. That often has a lot of that idea of concepts as kind of rules, or rules for the establishment of groups, probably is rooted in Kant. I mean, I'm talking in quite broad terms, so generally speaking, though, that's the way I encounter it, is by people who are quite influenced by Kant or Hegel, perhaps. Whereas an idea is also a kind of bringing together of singular things, specific things, into a group. You know, both of these things, ideas and concepts, are kind of ways of understanding the patterns of the world. You know, they're kind of typology. They're kind of ways of us grouping and grasping them, grouping things together in the world and grasping the world through that grouping things together. But ideas are different from concepts in some ways, primarily because their source of discussion about ideas is Plato, whereas the source, or this is one of the starting points for discussions about concepts, will be Kant. So quite often the same kind of problem is being talked about by the philosopher, but within a very different set of framework. And that doesn't mean to say that anyone who uses the word concept is a Kantian, or anyone who uses the word ideas is a Platonist. But the conversations in which that particular, that particular word is a central word, So the conversations where we're talking about ideas, or the conversation where we're talking about concepts, as I say, the sources of those conversations are different. And with ideas, the source of the conversation is Plato. And a kind of way of understanding Plato, which is terrible and you shouldn't do it, but if you've never done it before, then you can make the mistake and happily use it because everyone will kind of think it's normal. Is a way of thinking about Plato is that Plato talks about these things called forms, Platonic forms, and so every just person is just because they kind of share or participate in the form of justice, and so these forms are not in the world, because everything in the world is what it is because of its participation in some form. So they're kind of not necessarily supernatural, but they're definitely like, in the intellectual realm, if you like, even though they're also out there in the world somehow. This is kind of the core of Plato's Platonic forms, is it's a kind of an intellectual realm that's actually not inside our head but out there in the world. And obviously it was picked up and used by Christianity in the form of what's called Neoplatonism. Again, a bit of a broad brushstroke. There are differences there, but Christianity kind of picked up Platonism and turned it into Neoplatonism, in which obviously these Platonic forms, the form of justice, let's say, as our example, where these Platonic forms for the Christians and the Neoplatonists kind of exist in the mind of God. We've got this whole kind of theological baggage that goes with it. There's all sorts of difficulties with the idea that Plato holds a theory of forms. The most famous one being that actually he also knocks down the theory of forms. So, famously in a text called the Parmenides, which is one of his dialogues. So, the idea that there is a theory of Platonic forms, it's the theoretician who produces that theory is also at the same time the theoretician that produces the opposite of that theory, or one of its main problems. So it's a bit more of an ambiguous, the way in which I think, and they're not really, we're not going to call them forms, the way in which Platonic ideas, the role they seem to have within Plato's works, is both conceptual and argumentative, but also pedagogical. So it's there to try. A lot of the conversations that take place in the dialogues, and this is kind of crucial, are conversations in which we observe the working of the dialectic, if you to use a kind of tediously complicated phrase. So what I mean by that is we observe the workings of a discussion or an argument. We observe the workings of it. We're not, and this is partly to do with the way in which Platonic dialogues, the way in which the texts are presented. We're not inside the space. We have a kind of audience perspective on the space. It's often as though we're listening in intently, and but we're not the ear to the author, which is a much more traditional way of us reading philosophy. And obviously when those philosophers that write in the modern monologue form, not all of them by any means, but it's not uncommon for us to encounter that, particularly when it's relatively fluid and the rhetoric is minimal, and you have a kind of everyday language being used. What it can feel like is essentially you're being spoken to by the author, so you become the ear to their voice. Now that's quite different inside Platonic structures, because there's one of the difficulties in being the ear to someone's voice is where does your position of being able to be critical or think critically come from? Because you're kind of in this point of, if to be able to understand what the person is saying, you kind of need to give them the principle of charity. You need to kind of go with them for a bit of time. At what point do you reject or refuse? And more importantly, a text, I mean, this is something that Plato will talk about in some extent, but a text is not open to questioning directly in the moment of its presentation. And so the very act of discussion, when it's involved in monological texts, becomes much more prolonged, pronounced. It's much more difficult to kind of bring the things together. And often we find when we're trying to, I find at least, when we're trying to teach philosophy, often you're trying to take a text and place it back inside the conversation that it's part of, because the text presents as though it's kind of standalone, and it very rarely is. It's nearly always part of a conversation. So one of the nice things about the Platonic dialogues is that the dialogues produce a perspective from which you can kind of encounter what's going on a little bit more critically almost. You can kind of think, well, actually, Theseus's point here is great, and I quite like Empedocles' point. All right, and you can get a sense. This is the other thing. You can get a sense of the character of the argument. So the characters' names, even if it's a very limited one, in a very limited way, the characters begin to kind of give you a more than just an intellectual set of words. They're situated. So a kind of personality. And again, that's also used inside philosophy, other philosophical texts, but generally speaking, we're dealing in modern philosophy with a kind of monologue. So the Platonic engagement with ideas is less an engagement in which there's a clear count of the world that is being told to us, and which we are trying to be persuaded of. It's much more the presentation of a dialectic, a discussion, in which a way of thinking about the world is challenged and sometimes quite ruthlessly, and is kind of placed into its active mode, where it's being discussed and debated, and where we can kind of watch this take place and look at where it's strong and where it's weak. And so the ideas are the kind of like the guiding threads that enable these conversations to take place. And so I think they have a far more practical role beside Plato. And the idea of ideas, the idea of something like a Platonic form, has a far more practical role inside Plato, and inside Plato's works, I think, often than it does a kind of theoretical role. I wouldn't say it's as much a thought experiment, but it's like a way of beginning to think about something crucial, which is, what do things have in common? How do they have those things in common? The way of beginning to think about that, as it were, has to kind of engage with something like things have the colour in common because of some special thing out there that is called colour. In other words, they kind of, it's an option that will present itself and which has to be dealt with. This option of something like a form, something like an essence. It's an option that kind of has to be dealt with, in part because it's in part because it's being created by Plato, but in part also because it's being disputed by Plato as a possible way in which things can have similarities. So the ideas seem, as I say, a lot more interesting and a lot more to do with almost like teaching devices within the Platonic dialogues than they do as kind of answers to the way the world is. And so if ideas aren't theoretical constructs, they're not just ways in which we see the world, and you can kind of they're not like a different set of glasses. You can have this set of ideas or you can have that set of ideas. They're not substitutable for each other. So if your ideas are one of human equality and the combat of privilege, anti-hierarchical, it's not as though this is just not as though this is just a kind of different set of clothing that you're wearing, and the right wing set of ideas is somehow a different set of clothing, and that there's a kind of equality of status between each idea and but they can just be substituted one for the other, and we can just kind of play around with ideas. One of the things, what that kind of does is sort of say something like ideas are ways of seeing the world. They're just like spectacles, and there's an element of truth in that. But what's one of the things that's difficult there is it kind of removes the substance from the idea itself, and it leaves us as sort of the observer or the participant still sort of somehow neutral and in the background, as though I'm still here, even my ideas are out here, and there's this separation between us, and I can kind of try on ideas just like I can try on clothes or spectacles. And as I say, there's an element of truth in that in practice, but in fact ideas are far more closely connected to, I think, our existence as a particular type of entity. So let's call that human, because we all know that that's the generic name for us. So what it is to be human, I think, involves thinking about ideas as though they were part of our body, as though they were part of our organism, rather than part of our external decoration, rather than part of something like, rather than clothes or spectacles, or something interchangeable. And so ideas, I think, so when Paul used this phrase of ideas as kind of sources of nutrition, I think that's almost perfect in a way, because that kind of the process by which we engage in metabolism and the transformation of the world through us, and into us, that kind of process by which we are kind of connected through these different flows is exactly, I think, the kind of process that we need to think about and think of ourselves as engaged in when we're engaged with ideas. The idea of justice, or the true, or the good, or the beautiful, or now there's all sorts of difficulties about what would be an idea, but those kind of ideas, our engagement with them, as I say, is much more like the engagement of the flows that we're engaged with when we're eating, or we're having sort of various metabolic processes, drinking, for example, or taking drugs. These are also like ways in which we re-engage or we re-engineer our metabolism, and that re-engagement can be direct and immediate, or it can be long-term. So you can re-engage, re-engineer your metabolism through daily practice of 20 minutes of mindfulness, in a Buddhist center or something, or down the road, and you can do that for 5 years, and that's gonna re-engage and re-engineer sort of part of your flows. Or you can re-engineer changing your diet, maybe something that you're not, it's maybe going vegan, or maybe having stuff that you only cook yourself, or there can be a whole way in which you might re-engineer your desire, re-engineer your body through that. But you can also re-engineer through the engagement with certain kinds of ideas, and so obviously ideas like justice and freedom, for example, are the kind of ideas that I'm engaging with when I'm talking about things like revolution and desire. If you're interested in other kind of dynamics, dynamics of maybe inspiration or dynamics of beauty, then you might engage with the ideas of art or truth, or you might engage with the ideas, of poetry and those kind of things. But the engagement with an idea is a kind of engagement with as I say, more than just something that's an external to us. And what we try and do, I think, as philosophy, I think what we when it works, when philosophy actually works, when it's not covered by its day job, if you like, when philosophy actually works, one of the things it does is it shows how prolonged engagement with a particular idea can have a profound effect upon who it is you think you are, and who it is you're capable of being. And so in that sense, I think this idea of thinking about ideas as kind of sources of nutrition is a brilliant way, a brilliant metaphor, a brilliant kind of, not even a metaphor, it's a kind of accurate way of thinking about how to deal with ideas and how to engage with them. Now, obviously, that does involve us still doing a whole bunch of other stuff like, clarifying stuff, trying to pin down the arguments that are going on, trying to, in the same way that the engagement, let's say, with my motorbike, involves me in a completely different way, in a different relationship to the world around me. But I also have to engage with, how a clutch works, what petrol is, what a brake pad looks like when it's run out, and how to tell whether my tyres are, shitty, and all this kind of stuff. And so the practicalities of philosophy still exist, and there are lots of practicalities, often to do with argument and rhetoric. These are the kind of two kind of core elements. So in other words, how we connect concepts and ideas together, and how we express those connections. But in the end, as I say, those are still the day job. Those are still the things that the mechanic is doing with the car down the shop, and that I might be doing with my motorbike out in the road or whatever, in terms of maintenance. They're the day job maintenance philosophy, and they have to be kind of done, and there's a kind of certain sort of practice to getting to do those, and they can be very productive, just like a tinkerer can produce fantastically new, interesting machines. But in the end, that day job aspect of philosophy isn't what's most interesting about it. I think most interesting is when it begins to engage with ideas as nutrition. That brilliant example said. 10 to 8. Okay, I'm going to stop in a minute. We are still didn't quite get to all of what I wanted to talk about today. In fact, there's a couple of bits. I'm going to remind you again, as I say, Discord. If you're interested and you want to get involved and have a chat, that would be great. If you want to attend the Plato and Deleuze course and you're not on Free University Brighton's River, then you have two options. You can either let me know that you want to attend through Discord, in which case I will put the stuff there as well, or you can join the River, and that's not particularly difficult to do. No, that's not a thing to do. Thinking, can I? No, I'm not going to show it. It's not a particularly difficult thing to do. You can do that by going to the freeuniversitybrighton.org website. You can work out how to do it there. I will be beginning to read and think about the Phaedrus from now on. So next week I'm going to begin, even though the course doesn't start, we're going to begin sort of talking about and thinking about some basic ideas that come out of the Phaedrus, and that's probably going to now be what my thought shifts to till the end of this year. And I will possibly talk about other things, but once the course starts, obviously that will be the dominant content. But I'm going to begin shifting to that sort of thought and those kind of areas of thinking pretty much from now. So that's also worth bearing in mind. So if you are interested in Plato, then great, have a look at the Phaedrus. It's not too difficult to get hold of, and it's a really beautiful text in many ways. Otherwise, I will try you soon. And stay safe. And I don't know, should we have a catchphrase? Do philosophy. Let's do philosophy. Should be the catchphrase. I think we should have a catchphrase. Yes, I'll have to talk to some other people about that. We should have a catchphrase. Anyway. I'm drifting. I'm going to go and have a smoke and a drink. I will see you next week. Thanks very much, everyone.